Hi, I'm Nancy Davidoff Kelton. I am the playwright who wrote Finding Mr. RIGHTSTEIN. Please listen to this interview about my play. It was a lot of fun, even though my earring fell off. It was a lot of fun being here and talking to you all. Please listen to this interview about my play. My parents were theater buffs, and I grew up in Buffalo. And there was one legit theater there called Studio Arena. Jane Keeler started it. And they used to go to Toronto to the theater. And then as I got a little older, they took me. And in 1956, which lets you know my age, when I was 9, we went on my first trip to New York and we saw 3 shows. And the first one we saw was The Diary of Anne Frank, which I had read in school. And there wasn't a central aisle. There was aisles on the sides, and we were like in the 3rd row center. And after the play, and there was a standing ovation, my sister went up one aisle and my parents went up the other aisle, and the whole audience was going up. And I was about the only person still in the audience. I was on the stage in the attic with Otto Frank holding the diary. I was so there. I couldn't get up. I was glued to my seat. We saw The Most Happy Fella, because we couldn't get into My Fair Lady, and No Time for Sergeants, which didn't quite compare to the Diary of Anne Frank. So each year my parents brought me to New York, and I heard the names Neil Simon and Mike Nichols for the whole car ride, 9 hours from Buffalo to New York. They were one person. And I come from a funny family. And I don't know if they knew who the playwright was and who the director was, but I saw Barefoot right away, Barefoot in the Park, Elizabeth Ashley and Robert Redford. And I saw The Odd Couple, and we kept going. And then 1960 or 61, my father went with my mother to New York, and they saw The Miracle Worker. And my father came home and he said, "What are you doing the next 3 Saturdays?" I said, "Why?" He said, "I want to take you back to New York to see Patty Duke and Anne Bancroft and The Miracle Worker." The same thing happened again. I could not get out of my seat. And both main characters, Anne Frank and Helen Keller, they were about my age. And I totally connected. I totally connected to the theater and kept going back to New York, and knew I wanted to move here. One reason was to see a lot of shows, which I did and which I still do. I just, my husband and I walk to the theater, whether it's off Broadway or Broadway. I live on 16th Street, and and then the walk home is about a half hour, and we're still talking about the play. And some of the Wrongstein men I went out with before I met my husband would say to me, "We can stop talking about the show now." I could never stop talking about the show. And I never wanted to be a performer, but I like scribbling on my bed. And in my 30s, I attempted to write a couple plays, and I started showing them around. I had them bound where Neil Simon had his plays bound. I thought that would help. And I was divorced from my first husband. I had to figure out how to write and make a living. So it wasn't going to be playwriting. And I wrote for magazines and I wrote books. And I was very fortunate that I write very, very personally. I don't know if you've read my play, very personally. And I have written about my family, about some of the awful men who I have been with between marriages, and everything that's going on with me, about my teaching. And I felt very lucky writing about it. But I was always looking at the theater. I was always looking there. I just have always loved the theater, and it's what we talked about in my house. And the musicals too. There wasn't a time in my living room that The King and I, Oklahoma, or My Fair Lady were not playing. So, there I was. Growing up in Buffalo, we had a lot of snow. And on Saturdays, my father and I used to go to his office to take supplies, and there were always legal pads for me. And I couldn't wait to get home and curl up on my bed. And in 2nd grade, I wrote a poem about snow. I remember I'm not going to recite it, but Unless you want me to. But I wrote a poem about snow, and I showed it to Miss Carlson, my teacher, and she called my mother in and said, I think Nancy can write. And that was very exciting. And it is usually what was going on with me. And when my grandma died, and I wrote a poem to her, and my other grandma died 6 days later, and I didn't have the same strong attachment to her, and I couldn't write the poem, and the same kind of feeling. So I always wrote what was going on inside of me. My mother was ill when I was growing up. That's the thrust of the play. She struggled with mental illness, and I was always writing about that for myself. Where's mom? I don't understand it. Did I do that? And it came from a pretty deep place, not knowing that early on. I loved writing. The theater experience is, I guess there's a magic to it. I think that the actors totally, if they're enhancing the dialogue, connect with the audience and are enhancing the playwright's words. And I think if it's a good play, it's relatable for the most part. I mean, I write about family and a lot of dysfunction. And I think I just saw Mike Birbiglia, and I saw Danny Burstein and Nathan Lane in Pictures from Home. And they came to the edge of the stage and talked to us, talked to the audience. And I felt like they were talking right to me. I felt there was such an immediacy. I'm not a big television person. I love watching documentaries. I don't love it. I love good movies. I love great acting. I like the opening scene of The Godfather with Brando petting the cat and being Don Corleone. But I think you make a connection, a good actor, with the deep part of him or herself, and then they make it with the audience. I've written 7 books, and the first 4 were biographies. One on Helen Keller, when she was a child. They were all on great people when they were children and what provided a clue to their later greatness. I was teaching 2nd grade at the time, and I couldn't find anything. They were very straight biographies, and the kids were very bored by them. I kept going to the library and trying to find something. So I said, why don't I? This took a lot of chutzpah. I think what gets me into things is some chutzpah. Why don't I write something that they can connect to? And so I took experiences in the lives of Helen Keller, Harry Truman, the Wright brothers, and Harriet Tubman, and which provided a clue to who they became. And before I started sending these out to an agent and then to editors, it was very hard, and still is very hard to get an agent. I read them to my 2nd grade kids who did not have a long attention span, and they liked it. And one day I forgot a page at home, and they said, oh, what happens? What happens? So I think I knew I was onto telling a story about a kid. I mean, Harry Tubman he wasn't a baseball player, but he was the umpire. He was a good decision maker. And Helen Keller, it was when she said water, at the pump. And, they were each, Harriet Tubman got hit in the head, but I told this by a slave owner, and she said, I'm going to do something when I get older. And the Wright brothers were doing something with the sled. I found these stories very compelling, and I got it to using a limited, number of words for young kids. I wrote a book on writing because I've been a writing teacher for 40 years and writing from personal experience. That grew out of an article I wrote for Writer's Digest. I wrote a humor book on dating, gallows humor, of course. Then I wrote my memoir, Finding Mr. RIGHTSTEIN, from which I adapted the play. And my memoir, Finding Mr. RIGHTSTEIN, after my mother died, I wrote about her illness and how it impacted on me, both as a child, feeling unlovable, and then in my adult relationships. Why am I the only person who doesn't have the gene to sustain a relationship? And I was writing about dating, and I was writing about my dad, who I was attached to, but there was a price with that. And somehow I put that all together, was who I was as a little girl, why it's taking a reasonably smartish, person, decent enough company, having such a tricky time with a partnership. And I put it together and I thought both of those topics, not having perfect parents, which everybody in the world, I know one person who didn't relate and she didn't stay in my class very long, and struggling in relationships and, is it about them? Is it about me? What's going on? I put it all together and I typically see some humor in the pain, and I started sending it out, and there was my memoir. And when I launched Finding Mr. RIGHTSTEIN, the book, I had the best time reading sections with dialogue. I think that if I love dialogue. If I didn't write dialogue, I probably would. I hear voices. I think I'd be in a padded cell. It's my favorite thing. Describing things is more work for me than having my characters talk to each other. And I know playwriting is so much more than that. The first piece I ever sold 50 years ago was called The Teacher's Lunchroom, and it was about two first grade teachers discussing their classes and the reading in each of their classes and their pettiness a little bit in the teacher's lunchroom. But the whole piece was in dialogue, and it's the most fun I have writing. Of course, playwriting is so much more difficult than just, it's what to take out and this and this. I'm learning so much in this process, but it's fun, the writing of dialogue. I don't know if it was a need, but I tell my students, and I feel the same way about me, that if there's not a sense of urgency, you shouldn't write it. There has to be some kind of urgency. I just recently lost a friend, and the end of her life, I'm very pulled into our last few visits, and I wrote about it, and I just had the piece published. And the writing about my mother and having a fractured relationship and making peace with her and finding a place for her to live after my father died, I think they're very universal things, mothers and daughters, and the struggle, and then what to do with mom when she can't take care of herself. Do I take her in? Do I put her in a home? The guilt about putting her in a home, all those things. I was writing bits and pieces of that in the memoir, and then making short plays and having readings. And people came up to me after, I'm going through that with my mother. You made me cry. This is what I'm going through. And I think what I say is very relatable. Instead of staying too long with men who are not going to be keepers. It just all came together, and I wanted to tell this story, and I can't write about other, Finding Mr. RIGHTSTEIN is somewhat fictionalized, and I went deeper than I did in the memoir, but I think my story is a story that is very, very, the deeper I go and the more personal I am, the more universal it seems to me that it is. So Joanna, age 50-ish, is divorced, and her father has died, and he's still her main man. She can't quite go forward. And he filled up a lot of space for a lot of reasons. It's partly her and partly the two of them. And she wants to move on. And her mother's in a home, and she goes out with people. She goes to her therapist to find out why is my life not exactly working. And there's flashbacks to who her father and mother were with her, and they both put her down in the looks department. So she didn't think that she was very pretty, and that was difficult. And she had to sort out what was them. I guess we all do. And I think what's our parents and what is us? And what do we carry? And we do carry so much of our past with us, and the stuff, what's self-sabotaging, until we work it out. Oh, they had a problem and I am lovable. And it takes a lot of work to find oneself and to love oneself enough, I think, to love another person. And I think that's the story I wanted to tell. I hope that there is a reaction. I hope that sometimes there's a gasp or a chuckle where I might not think there would be. When I was talking to Meredith, the director, she said there was a line, it was so tiny. And she said, but it showed the change in Joanna and her mother's relationship. And I am so touched that she found that the tiny lines show the arc, things changing in the play. I want to feel that the audience is feeling it and getting it and saying, oh my God, she's like writing about me, or how'd she know? I want to have that feeling. I want to feel that I'm connecting. I think people have, if people who get in touch with themselves have stories to tell. And if telling my story about having a mother who was ill, and it impacted on me, and it impacted on my sister, and how I viewed men, and how I viewed love. Oh, she can write about that. You don't have to have a terminal illness, and you don't have to have sexual or physical abuse to write a story. I think many people have stories to tell, and maybe it will empower them to tell their stories and certainly listen to one that's entertaining.